The Bigfoot led his only friend into a cave. What he saw inside was shocking. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now settle into a quiet place, breathe deep, and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into tonight's tale. Tonight, across the gray snowfields of Montana. In the late 19th century, the wind howled through the pines, carrying a chill that cut straight to the bone. A lonely rancher stepped out of his wooden cabin, the flame of an oil lamp trembling in his hand. Down by the creek, massive footprints pressed deep into the mud, stained with the dark red of fresh blood. He stood frozen, his heart heavy, for this was no longer just a campfire legend. Something out there waiting in the shadows had come, and tonight it would change his fate forever. The man on the edge of the world, Montana, in the closing years of the 19th century. Winter had begun to tighten its grip on the valley. Snow lay heavy across the cabin roof, while winds poured down from the Bitterroot Mountains, sharp as blades against bare skin. Inside the quiet wooden house, the firelight cast trembling strokes of orange along the rough plank walls. Chester Ward, a 49-year-old rancher, lived in solitude at the forest's edge. Folks said he had once known family life, but the fever took it all, leaving behind an emptiness no labor could fill. Since then, Chester chose the life apart, planting potatoes, tending a few thin cattle, and sometimes riding his horse down to town to trade for salt or flour. He spoke little, his eyes often drawn to the horizon as if searching for something he had lost. The townspeople rarely called him by name. To them, Chester was the watcher of the woods, a man who lived on the margins of the world. Yet on long winter nights when the whiskey loosened their tongues, a story slipped between them in the forest near Chester's land. There was something larger than any bear, silent as a phantom, leaving behind enormous tracks and a distant haunting cry. Chester heard such words but never answered. He knew the woods kept their secrets, and sometimes survival meant leaving them hidden. But one early morning when he went down to the creek for water, he saw its prints pressed deep into the brittle ice, twice the size of a man's foot. And across the white snow stretched a smear of red bright as fresh blood. Chester froze. The wind tugged at his collar, carrying the scent of pine and rusted iron. In that instant, his usual loneliness gave way to something else, unease, and strangely curiosity. What he did not know was that from that night onward, his life's path would turn toward another, where the shadow of Bigfoot would step out of legend and straight into his fate. Part 1. Strange Tracks. Dawn crept slowly after a night of snow. The first rays of sunlight barely touched the mountain peaks in gold, while the valley below remained steeped in shades of ash gray. Chester carried a wooden bucket down to the creek for water. The icy current stung his hands like needles, but there by the muddied bank, he froze. Before him lay a massive imprint, 5 toes clear as day, the sole so wide it could have swallowed his cowboy boot twice. Water trickled into the deep grooves, catching the light with an uncanny shimmer. Chester bent down, calloused fingers brushing the indentation. The mud was still damp. This mark had been left only last night. Nearby, a branch hung broken at a height no ordinary man could have reached. A faint breeze drifted by, carrying the raw scent of wet earth and crushed pine. A shiver crawled down his spine. He had heard the tavern stories often enough, towering figures glimpsed through mist growls like thunder rolling from the mountains. Folks called it by many names: Wildman, Sasquatch, Bigfoot. Chester had always thought such tales nothing more than fireside warnings for children, but now the proof lay at his feet. He straightened slowly, eyes sweeping the silent forest. No bird calls, no rustling leaves. The whole woodland seemed to be holding its breath. Chester drew in a breath of his own, the smell of smoke from last night's fire still clinging to his damp wool coat. And softly, almost to himself, he whispered, "Something out there is watching." Part 2. The Gaze in the Dark. That evening, Chester followed the narrow trail, guiding his cattle back toward the corral. The sinking sun laid amber streaks across the thin trunks of pine. The air pressed heavy, strange, unsettled. Horses startled with sudden cries, eyes wide, hooves pawing as if they caught the scent of a predator. Chester tightened his grip on the reins, scanning the woods. And then he saw it. Between the thinning trees stood a figure tall and still. Over 7 feet shoulders, as broad as oak, its body shrouded in dark fur that blended with the shadows. Only the eyes, deep shining, fixed directly on him. For a heartbeat, time itself froze. Chester pressed against the trunk of a tree heart, hammering against his ribs. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but the figure did not waver. It remained unmoving, as though carved into the forest itself. Wind hissed through the branches. A twig cracked. Chester's breath spilled in pale clouds into the bitter air. Yet the creature did not charge. It only stood silent, watchful. And those eyes, they were not the eyes of a beast alone. There was something more in them, something solemn, unspoken beyond words. Fear gripped him, primal and sharp, and yet alongside it, curiosity stirred, strange and insistent. Chester leaned out half a step, daring to see more clearly. But just then the figure tilted its head ever so slightly and vanished into the trees as if it had never been. Chester remained, frozen reins trembling in his hand. He knew then that he had locked eyes with something most folks only ever heard in legend, and from that moment on his quiet, lonely peace was broken for good. Part 3. The Thread of Trust. In the days that followed, the woods around the cabin held a silence unlike any Chester had known. He never spoke of it to anyone, but deep inside he understood somewhere out there a pair of eyes was watching him. Each trip to the creek, each stroke of the axe against wood, he could feel that hidden presence. One evening after kindling the fire, Chester wrapped a piece of bread and a few strips of dried meat into a small cloth pouch. He carried it to the forest's edge, where the moonlight spilled over damp leaves, and placed it on a flat stone. He offered no words of explanation, simply set it down, then turned back to the cabin. By morning, the pouch was gone. In its place lay a few broken pine twigs, scattered needles wet with dew. Chester crouched, studying them in silence. He could not be certain, yet something inside him stirred a quiet sense that his gesture had been answered. On the second night, he did the same. Bread, dried meat. This time, just as he turned to go, a sound drifted from the darkness, a heavy, low breath, deep as if drawn from a giant chest. Chester froze, too afraid to look back. His heart pounded, but he left the pouch where it lay and returned quietly to the cabin. On the third night, when Chester stepped onto the porch, the moonlight revealed a towering shape standing a short distance away. Bigfoot. It did not move closer. It simply waited. Chester set the food upon the ground, then slowly stepped back. The figure bent down, lifting the bundle with a hand broad and covered in dark fur. No growl, no threatening move, only the faintest nod as if to acknowledge. Chester's throat tightened. In that hushed moment, an unseen cord stretched between them, not woven from words, but from patience and the fragile beginnings of trust. From that night on, fear no longer held its full weight within him. It was replaced by something else, something Chester thought he had lost long ago, the hope that even in the deepest forest shadows connection could still be found. Part 4. Unusual Signs. That night the wind swept through the pines, carrying with it a strange whistle, like whispers of sorrow, drifting through the dark. Chester sat inside his cabin, an old Bible in his hands, though his eyes could not follow the lines of print. He was long accustomed to silence, yet tonight, that silence pressed heavy on his chest. Then came a sound outside the weight of footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not deer, not horse. Chester set the book aside, reached for his oil lamp, and gently pushed the door open. At the edge of the clearing stood the familiar figure, Bigfoot. But something was different. It did not stand calm as before. Its shoulders shook with ragged breaths, its heavy steps grinding deep hollows into the soil. Its eyes, once steady, were dark with unrest. It looked at Chester, then quickly back toward the forest, where the shadows knit together in thick layers. Again it turned its gaze, pleading. A branch snapped beneath its weight as it stepped closer. Chester gripped the handle of the lamp heart, pounding throat dry. This time the creature moved its arm, not in the gesture of taking food, but with clear intent. Its great hand opened, sweeping toward the woods like a summons. "You want me to follow, Chester?" whispered, scarcely believing the words as they left his mouth. Bigfoot did not answer. It only stood there, breath steaming into the frozen air, eyes locked on him, restless, urgent, almost begging. Inside Chester, a strange stirring rose, not only fear, but the sharp edge of a premonition that something grave awaited beyond. His hand tightened. Slowly he gave a nod. The creature bent slightly, then turned, moving into the blackness, leaving deep footprints pressed into the damp earth. Chester drew a long breath, blew out the lamp to keep from casting light, and stepped off the porch. For the first time in his life, he placed his trust in a being that belonged only to legend, and he did not know that from that moment forward, the path ahead would lead him to a place no man had ever dared set foot. Part 5. The Secret Path. Chester followed his boots, sinking into the damp carpet of fallen leaves. Ahead, the towering figure of Bigfoot moved with certainty, each step as if it knew every tree, every twisted root. For Chester, the way was utterly unknown, a trail he had never seen in all his years here. Around them, the forest shifted. The wind stilled, night birds fell silent. Even the insects offered no sound. Only the heavy rhythm of footsteps pressed against the forest floor. A shiver crept through Chester. It was as though the whole woodland held its breath, bearing witness to their passage. Moonlight filtered through the branches, spilling silver across Chester's coat and outlining the pale mist of his breath. Cold sweat ran down his back, though the air was bitter with frost. Deep within, he sensed this was no chance encounter. Something waited ahead, something more. Branches scraped his shoulders, thorns tore at the wool of his sleeve. Still, he walked on, careful to keep the distance just right, not so near as to threaten, not so far as to be left behind. He knew that if Bigfoot wished, it could vanish into the darkness with a single stride. But tonight, it wanted him to follow. The ground sloped downward. The air grew damp mist clinging to his skin. The smell of earth thickened, heavy, raw, and mingled with it was something sharp, metallic, unmistakable. The scent of old blood. Chester's chest tightened. Every instinct warned him, yet his feet moved forward, driven by the pleading look he had seen in those eyes. Bigfoot never turned back, only pressed steadily on. Its massive body parted the brush, carving a way Chester could never have found on his own. And then, breaking through one last tangle of undergrowth, Chester looked up. Before him rose a sheer wall of rock draped in green moss, cold and forbidding as a curtain drawn over ancient secrets. At its base yawned a narrow fissure, black and silent like the open jaws of some enormous beast. Bigfoot stopped, shifted aside, and for the first time that night turned to meet Chester's gaze. Its wide hand lifted, motion firm, unmistakable, step inside. Chester froze, his fingers tightening on the strap of his bag. All the blood in his body seemed to surge to his heart. At that shadowed threshold, he knew one more step, and his life would never be the same. Part 6. The cave's door. Chester stood rigid before the moss-covered wall, breath-quick chest rising and falling in the icy night. The dark fissure before him gaped like the mouth of a colossal beast, swallowing the moonlight whole. From within drifted a damp current of air, thick with the scent of old earth and clinging moss. Bigfoot turned back, its eyes glinting faintly in the dark, no longer pleading, now resolute. It lifted its massive hand palm open, pointing into the hollow. The motion was firm, commanding, and yet beneath it lay something more. Trust. Enter human. Chester's grip tightened on the cloth satchel at his side. 100 questions battered his mind. What lies inside? Why bring me here? Will I ever come back out? Yet all were drowned by a strange pull, a force that left no room for retreat. The invisible cord had been tied, and now he could not turn away. He raised his oil lamp. The flame quivered, its pale glow trembling against the slick, mossy stone. Water dripped somewhere deeper, each drop echoing slow and hollow like the beat of a far-off drum. One step. His boot struck the cold floor, the sound reverberating against stone walls. Chester paused, listening. Nothing, save the thunder of his own heart in his ears. He swallowed hard, then took another step. The darkness folded around him, swallowing the gray wool of his coat. Behind him, Bigfoot moved forward, its massive body filling the entrance, sealing away the night sky, and with it, every chance of turning back. The lamp's light danced along the jagged walls, casting fleeting shapes that writhed like captive spirits. Chester drew in a breath, lungs filling with the damp tang of stone and pine resin. A tremor ran the length of his spine. And then he saw it. Deeper still, another light. Not the flicker of his own lamp, but a dim orange glow, wavering like firelight. Alongside it came a sound low and steady, not the growl of beasts, but the breath of many lungs rising and falling together. Chester stopped in his tracks, eyes widening. At last he understood beyond this threshold, he was not facing a single creature. Something far greater awaited him. Part 7. The Tribe in the Dark. The oil lamp trembled in Chester's hand, casting a faint circle of light. Slowly, the darkness ahead revealed its shape, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. A vast chamber opened before him like the hollow chest of the mountain itself. The ceiling stretched so high the firelight could not touch it. Moss-slick stone glistened with the dim glow of smoldering embers scattered here and there. Wisps of smoke curled upward, thickening the air like a low mist. Within that haze, eyes appeared, one pair, then another, then dozens more. Amber eyes glowing like live coals, all fixed upon him. Chester held his breath, fingers clutching the lamp's handle until they shook. Shapes emerged from the shadows, colossal forms. Bigfoot. Not one, not two. A tribe. Some stood massive, shoulders wide as cliff faces. Others smaller, clinging to their mother's sides, round eyes bright against the dark. They stood in a ring, silent, a living wall around the stranger in their midst. Chester felt his knees weaken. All his life he had heard stories of Bigfoot, but he had believed it was one creature, a solitary legend. And yet the truth stood before him. They were a people hidden away in the deep forest, living beyond the reach of mankind. None moved closer. None growled. They only stood, their eyes steady upon him. The silence was more frightening than any roar. Chester could hear his own heartbeat thundering against the cave walls. He thought to step back, but the Bigfoot who had led him here placed a hand gently on his shoulder, pressing lightly a wordless reassurance, "Do not fear." In that instant, Chester realized how small he truly was. A lonely man standing before beings of myth, carried down from an age before men spoke. And somehow, they had chosen to trust him. His heart tightened, and within himself he whispered, "Lord, why me then?" As if moved by one will, every gaze in the circle turned toward the center of the cave, where a massive form lay stretched across a stone slab, its breath shallow, rasping like the last wind of winter. Part 8. The Silent Plea. At the cave's heart lay a giant figure motionless on the cold stone. It was a Bigfoot, older and larger than any Chester had ever imagined. Its thick coat was streaked with gray, its chest rising in fragile waves, each breath heavy and strained as if life itself was slipping away. The fire's glow revealed the sheen of sweat on its face, the faint blue veins beneath its skin. Each inhalation sent a tremor through its massive body, as though strength was being stripped away with every breath. Chester froze. He understood at once this was no ordinary one. This was the leader, the heart of the tribe. And that heart was failing. Around them, the Bigfoot moved with slow reverence. No growls, no rush forward. Instead, they lifted their vast, calloused hands, palms open, all turned toward Chester. A gesture without words, pleading. In their amber eyes, he saw worry, despair, and trust. Trust placed in him a man. Chester's pulse raced. He staggered back a step, his mouth dry. I am no healer. I've only a few herbs, a strip of cloth." No answer came. Only the unblinking eyes and the low sound rising from their chests, a deep, steady resonance, like a chant of prayer carried through stone. The Bigfoot who had brought him stepped forward, eyes fierce with urgency. It pointed to Chester, then pressed its great hand against its own chest, bowing low. The message was clear. "We entrust him to you." Chester stood still, the weight of it pressing like a mountain on his shoulders. He thought of his empty cabin, the years spent as a man on the edge of the world, unseen and unneeded. Never had he believed his life could matter. And yet now an entire tribe placed their hope in him. He drew a deep breath, his trembling hand reaching for the satchel at his side, inside a few dried herb scraps of old bandage. He gave a faint nod. In that moment, the resonant hum of the tribe lowered in pitch, as if exhaling relief. Chester stepped onto the stone slab, kneeling beside the ancient leader, his hand brushing the sweat-soaked fur. The weak breath carried the scent of earth and pine resin. He closed his eyes and whispered, as though to himself, "All right, I'll try." Part 9. Healing in Silence. In the days that followed, Chester's life changed. No longer was he the lonely rancher who lingered by the creek or tended a small garden. Each morning as the first light filtered through the pines, he packed his satchel with herbs, bandages, and a flask of water, then quietly walked the hidden path into the cave. The Bigfoot tribe awaited him in silence. They stood in a circle, their amber eyes fixed on his every move. At first, those gazes were heavy, sharp with suspicion, like knives poised at his back. But as the days passed, when they saw Chester wipe the sweat from the old leader's brow tip, a wooden cup to cracked lips or crush herbs to rub across a laboring chest, their eyes began to change. Distrust gave way to respect, and respect became trust. Inside the cavern, no words were spoken. Only the drip of water from the stone ceiling, the faltering but slowly strengthening breaths of the elder, and the steady rhythm of Chester's hands. His work was simple: replace damp cloths with dry ones, fan away the heat, whisper words the creature could not understand. But he spoke them anyway, because perhaps he needed to hear a human voice in that vast, silent dark. At times, memories overwhelmed him. He felt as though he were back in those sorrowful days, tending to his wife and child, during the fever, fighting for each fragile breath. The memory blurred his eyes and tightened his grip. He had failed then, but now he could not allow himself to fail again. Each time the elder's breath faltered, Chester's heart clenched. Each time the fading eyes opened, a flicker of hope returned. The tribe did not interfere. They gave him silence, absolute and unbroken, as though their very stillness was a prayer. And then one morning, as Chester lifted the cup to the elder's lips, a massive hand twitched. A single finger quivered, brushing against Chester's wrist. He froze, eyes wide. Around him the tribe bowed their heads ever so slightly, and in their eyes gleamed a light he had not seen before. Trust answered. In that instant, Chester understood he was no longer merely a stranger. He had become part of their sacred circle of silence. And with all his heart he continued his work, steady as a man tending a fire through a storm. Part 10. The Sacred Moment. One winter afternoon, the wind howled outside the cliffs, carrying the sting of ice into the cavern's mouth. Chester entered, carrying his flask of water and a bundle of clean cloths. The scene was familiar now. The ring of silent Bigfoot, the glow of smoldering embers, the massive figure of the elder stretched upon the stone. But today was different. The ragged breaths were no longer broken. They came stronger, deeper. As Chester drew near, the old eyes opened wider than ever before, no longer dulled by pain, but alight like a flame returning. Chester knelt, laying his hand gently on the creature's shoulder. "Easy now. Just breathe," he whispered. The leader rumbled low, not in menace, but in reply. With effort that shook his frame, he pressed his hands to the stone, his whole body trembling. The tribe leaned forward, silence thick as the air itself. Chester hurried to brace him, his thin shoulders pressed against a weight as heavy as the mountain. And then slowly, with unyielding resolve, the great elder stood. Firelight flared, casting their shadows tall upon the cave wall, one small man supporting a giant of legend. In that moment, no words were needed. They all knew a miracle had come to pass. The tribe did not shout. They bowed. Every towering figure, young and old alike, lowered their heads before Chester. A gesture more sacred than language, a vow of eternal gratitude. Chester's throat tightened. He was no healer, no hero, only a lonely rancher who had once lost everything. Yet here he stood in the circle of myth, received and honored as one of their own. The young Bigfoot, the one who had led him here, stepped forward. It pressed a broad hand to its chest, then pointed to Chester. The meaning was clear. You are one of us. In the wavering firelight, Chester's eyes blurred with tears, and he knew with absolute certainty this moment would remain with him for the rest of his days. An unfading mark. Weeks later, when patches of ice began to melt and the forest birds found their song again, Chester returned to the hidden path. He carried with him a quiet hope to see those amber eyes once more. But inside the cave, only silence remained. No glowing embers. No deep rumbling breaths. The stone floor lay empty, marked only by faint traces, broad footprints hardened in dry mud, a fragment of charred wood, and the lingering scent of old smoke drifting in the air. Chester stood in the hollow of the mountain, his small oil lamp flickering in his hand. His heart ached for a moment, then softened. They were gone, the tribe vanished back into the deep woods, as though they had never been. He reached out, pressing his thin hand to the mossy wall. Cold, empty, yet within there stirred a warmth unlike any he had known. He understood then he had walked through a moment that comes only once in a lifetime. On the way home, the wind carried the fresh scent of pine. Chester smiled faintly, and in his eyes shone something he thought long-lost faith. Faith that even in the shadows of legend, kindness could still carve a path. From that day on, whenever he sat on his porch, gazing toward the forest, Chester no longer felt alone. He had found another kind of family, one he might never see again yet, whose bond would live in his heart forever. He whispered into the breeze as though sending a prayer. Some secrets are not meant to be proven, only to be kept. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and tell us your city and rate it from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next healing tale from the Wild West.